Hi, I'm Michael Christensen, and I've been working on some more writing, and we're going to talk about writing some more. Last week, I did a video about the rules of your story, and this week I'm going to talk about the rules of your world and how they are different. Similar, but different. For example, one thing I talked about last week was how does death work in your world? And really what I meant is how does death work in your story? We know how death works generally in our world, and probably your world works pretty similar, but that's not necessarily true. For example, when a character dies in your world, do we know what happens to them when they die? Do we see them pass on? Is that part of the world that you are building? Because if you decide to show that, you just did an incredible amount of world building. You've established that there is an afterlife, that people go there. And just by saying whatever happens next, whatever they experience, you're telling us a lot about maybe how you view death, but certainly how it works in your world. Now that's up to you. Is there one or is there not in your world of your fiction? But if you show us one, if you show us a moment at or after death, you're telling us that there is. With the number of people dying in the US and some of them very important people on whom democracy hinges, I think a lot about the afterlife these days. What about damage? How much damage can a person take in your world? If you watch something like Die Hard, John McClane takes an incredible amount of punishment throughout that film. Indiana Jones even more so. But there are also limits, how far we expect something can go until it's no longer reasonable to assume that they survived. For example, John McClane does not get shot throughout Die Hard, at least during the first one. And I don't believe he gets shot during the third one either. I've only seen the second one once because it was bad. And the fourth one, he shoots himself in the shoulder, but that's the end of the movie, so you can assume that he survives, makes it through. Generally speaking, he takes abuse that someone could potentially survive. A lot of people in stories get shot or they get grazed, and they walk it off, or they keep going, they keep pushing through, but that's not true of every story. In Seven, there's a whole scene where Brad Pitt talks about a cop that he saw take a bullet who then died on the way to the hospital. And that's in there to let us know if someone gets shot in this story, they're probably not just going to walk it off and keep doing their cop thing. You know, we need to know that we are not watching a Arnold Schwarzenegger style movie, which, I mean, we're 2 deaths into that film already. We should actually already know what kind of movie we're watching. But that's in there to let us know what to expect. And it tells us a lot about the world. This is a world where bullets matter. If you get hit with one, presumably that's it. That tells us how the world works, because the world of Indiana Jones is not compatible with the world of Seven. They exist on separate wavelengths. Granted, Indiana Jones also does not get shot, but if he had, it's probable he could have walked it off or kept fighting. John McClane, same thing. He takes a bit of punishment. He's able to power through it purely through his own willpower, because Indiana Jones and Die Hard both depict a world where your willpower will keep you going. But let's talk about the biggest way that your world could be different from ours: magic, or the supernatural. What are the rules? Do vampires burn in daylight or do they not? That is a relatively recent introduction in vampire lore. It only happened in the last 100 years, 150 years. So if you don't want to have them burn in daylight, if you want them to sparkle, for example, that's totally fine. You can do that. No one can tell you that you can't. You can do that. Those are the rules of your world. You're telling us that vampires don't burn in the day, and that's okay. Where it becomes a problem is if you have a character walk in daylight, he sparkles, goes in daylight, he sparkles, goes in daylight, he bursts into flame the third time. If you haven't told us why that happens, that's a problem. Your world has rules because all of us view the world through a lens. I have things that I assume about the world, rightly or wrongly, and those things manifest in my writing. You know, for example, I don't believe in supernatural things beyond a certain limit. You know, I'm a man of faith, but I also believe that things only manifest in the world up to a point. So I don't tend to get that invested in a story like Paranormal Activity, where it tries to push me beyond the limit of what I believe can happen. That being said, something like Ghostbusters, I totally buy into, because Ghostbusters does not pretend to be in our world. It purports this is the world of Ghostbusters, where the dead come back, and they look like this, and they look weird, and they look like puppets, and it's a whole big thing. And I can meet you on that level. It's when a film tries to say, this is our world, and this is how our world works, buy in, that I have difficulty. I can't buy into Blair Witch Project because I don't believe in the things that are depicted in Blair Witch Project. I don't believe in the things that happen in Cloverfield either, but I can buy in because we're not meant to believe that. We're meant to believe it as it happens. Could Cloverfield happen in your world? Is that compatible with how you view your setting? That's a good approach to figuring out how elastic are the rules of your world. Can you take something like Iron Man, which is probably the most grounded and realistic of the Marvel films and still has things that require suspension of disbelief? Could that happen in your setting? Would it feel out of place? Or is your setting robust enough where, yeah, that could happen, and it could totally be incorporated? If you're telling a story where there are already aliens, then the level of technology that we see in Iron Man may not feel out of place, but it also might. Because if you're trying to tell a story where you have grounded, realistic technology, and the aliens arriving, their technology is far, far more advanced than anything that we have, then a perpetual energy source like the arc reactor is probably a bridge too far. That's the thing I try to think about all the time. When I'm watching a movie like Indiana Jones, it's very easy for me to picture that folding into the Marvel world because Captain America already basically is an Indiana Jones movie. If I'm watching The Fault in Our Stars, that's harder for me to reconcile. That would not be a story where that would feel like it would actually make sense. I talk about Marvel a lot, and I'm still going to. I'm going to keep doing that. You can't stop me. I think there's a reason why they waited so long to introduce magic. When we get to Thor, they very much talk about him like he's an alien. They acknowledge that he's worshipped as a god, but they don't really call him one. He maybe buys in a little bit to his hype, but he talks about himself as the son of Odin, or just as Thor. He doesn't really refer to himself as a god in that film. And even when you get to Avengers, yes, you have aliens, just like Thor is to a certain degree, but they're very hesitant to call anything magic. This gets particularly egregious in Age of Ultron when they're trying to describe Scarlet Witch's powers, and instead of saying that she's magical in any way, they just call her weird. And it's because they didn't know how to reconcile that character, who has magic in the comics, with the world that they'd established. Then Doctor Strange comes along, and honestly, they should have introduced that before Scarlet Witch so that they could actually just say that she's doing the same stuff he's doing, but hindsight. When you write, you put up invisible barriers, invisible bumpers, basically, and something will bounce off of it, and you'll feel it. You'll know when it happens. You'll know when something happens and you realize, this doesn't feel right. At which point, your goal is then to reverse course or find a way to reconcile it with the story that you've told so far. That's how you figure out the rules of your world. If you say, oh, I know that they just fell 80 feet, but I feel like it should be shorter distance because otherwise they would just die. Yeah, probably. But if you don't think that that's a problem, if you think you can justify it based on what we've set up so far, certainly characters in movies like The Matrix or Captain America have falls that should kill normal people, but don't kill those characters. There are in-world explanations for those. It's up to you to figure out where the limit is. What is reasonable for someone to endure, to survive, to persist? That's it, just a little video about the rules of your world. They are different than the rules of your story. Story rules, which we talked about last week, are what are you willing to depict? The rules of the world is what is plausible, what can actually happen. And next week we're going to talk a little bit more about this when we talk about suspension of disbelief and where it differs from the rules of your world. If you like the video, you can leave me a comment or hit the thumbs up button and just let me know what you thought. If you have any more ideas for rules, if this makes any sense to you. If you disagree with me entirely, go ahead and engage in the comments below. Please subscribe if you haven't already and ring the bell so you know when new videos come out. And hopefully they will come out more often now that I don't have bronchitis. That does it for me. I love you, Victoria.